Hey guys, tonight we begin with the ancient Egyptian doctor, a profession where you're expected to heal broken bones, fight infections, interpret divine will, and somehow make all of that look confident. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your day begins before the sun, because the sun at least has the decency to hesitate before committing to another scorching Egyptian day. You, however, do not get that luxury. If you are an ancient Egyptian doctor, sleeping in is not an option. Pain does not respect schedules, fever does not care about your rest, and childbirth will absolutely begin at the most inconvenient moment possible. You rise from your sleeping mat with the enthusiasm of someone who already knows today will involve blood, complaints, and at least one patient who insists they followed your instructions when you personally watch them do the opposite. The air is still cool, Egypt's brief daily apology, and you enjoy it while it lasts. First comes washing. This is essential, not because anyone understands bacteria, but because cleanliness equals order, and order keeps the universe from unraveling into divine chaos. Or so the priests say. You wash your hands carefully, knowing full well that by midday they will be covered in substances no amount of rinsing will emotionally prepare you for. Being a doctor puts you in an awkward social category. You are respected, but not powerful. Trusted, but suspiciously watched. People believe you possess knowledge, but also believe that if something goes wrong, you probably annoyed a god by blinking incorrectly. This means your morning routine requires confidence, humility, and a quiet internal promise not to anger any invisible forces before breakfast. You mentally review the possibilities for the day. Broken bones, manageable; cuts, acceptable; fevers, concerning; infections, deeply annoying. There is also the mysterious category of something is wrong, but I cannot explain what, which will inevitably arrive accompanied by dramatic sighing. Outside, the city is already waking up. Bakers are at work. Labourers are heading toward construction sites, where they will absolutely injure themselves in new and exciting ways. Somewhere, a man is lifting something far too heavy and thinking, "This seems fine," moments before proving you wrong. You pause before opening your door, not to pray exactly, but to brace yourself. You remind yourself that you are trained. You have scrolls. You have remedies that work more often than they fail, which by ancient standards is an incredible success rate. You are not guessing. You are practicing medicine. Early, imperfect, slightly chaotic medicine. Still, you know how this goes. Some patients will walk out relieved. Some will not. And by sunset, you will carry both outcomes equally, because doctors do not get the luxury of celebrating too loudly or grieving too openly. You open the door. Someone is already waiting, and they do not look patient. After opening the door and confirming that yes, people are already waiting, and yes, they all look impatient, you turn back inside to gather your tools. This is the part of the job where modern viewers tend to relax, until they realize what ancient Egyptian medical equipment actually consists of. There is no gleaming metal tray, no polished instruments, no reassuring clink of stainless steel. Instead, you work with copper blades, wooden probes, linen bandages, stone pallets, and jars filled with substances best described as confidently experimental. These tools are not decorative. They are practical. They have been used before, sometimes successfully. You inspect your copper knife. Copper is excellent. It cuts, it lasts, and it occasionally kills bacteria without anyone knowing why. This is what passes for accidental genius. You wipe the blade carefully, not because you believe it is sterile, but because it feels responsible and gives patients confidence. Confidence, you have learned, is a powerful painkiller. Next come the bandages. Linen. Clean. Folded neatly. Reused when absolutely necessary and never discussed out loud. You soak some in resin or honey, depending on the injury. Honey, in particular, is one of your proudest tools. It works suspiciously well, which makes you trust it deeply while understanding it not at all. Your jars line the wall like a shelf of questionable optimism. Animal fat, ground herbs, oils infused with plants whose names you barely remember but whose effects you have observed. Some reduce swelling, some soothe pain, some do absolutely nothing but smell impressive. You keep them anyway. Patients like options. Then there are the scrolls, papyrus texts copied and recopied by generations of physicians. They describe symptoms, treatments, outcomes, and instructions written in the careful language of people who have seen things go wrong. These scrolls are not theory. They are records. Someone tried this remedy. Someone lived. Someone didn't. Notes were taken. You review them quickly, not because you need reminding, but because ritual matters. Preparation matters. The act of checking your tools is part medicine, part performance. Patients need to see that you are organized. Order reassures them that you know what you are doing. Even when the situation is deeply questionable, with everything gathered, you take one last look around your workspace. It is ready. You are ready. Or at least as ready as anyone can be in a world where illness is half physical and half divine mood swing. You take a breath. Then you call in your first patient, hoping they are bleeding in a way you recognize. Your first patient steps inside before you even finish sitting down, which immediately tells you two things. 1. This injury is serious. 2. This man has been waiting long enough to decide politeness is optional. He is a labourer, which explains the dust, the sweat, and the expression of someone who has already tried ignoring the problem and failed. His arm hangs at an angle that arms are not designed to explore. This is unfortunate, but also reassuring. Bones are honest. Bones break in recognizable ways. Bones do not pretend they are fine while secretly plotting your downfall. You gesture for him to sit. He does not sit. He hovers, grimacing, breathing carefully, as if moving too quickly might cause his arm to detach entirely. You examine the limbs slowly, pressing and rotating just enough to confirm what you already know. He hisses through his teeth. You nod sympathetically. This is the ancient equivalent of bedside manner. The diagnosis is clear. A fracture. Not shattered, not compound, just broken. In your profession, this counts as a good start to the day. You explain what will happen next in a calm voice. This is important. The body reacts better when the mind believes it is in capable hands. Also, panicking patients flail, and flailing patients make your job harder. You recite a short incantation while preparing the splint. The words are familiar, traditional, and comforting. They are not strictly necessary for the bone, but they are extremely necessary for everyone else in the room. Then comes the part no one enjoys. You pull. The arm shifts back into place with a dull, wet sound that makes everyone pause to reconsider their life choices. The labourer gasps, then exhales slowly, as if his soul briefly left and decided to return. You do not apologize. Apologies invite doubt. You simply continue working. You bind the arm with linen soaked in resin, securing the splint tightly, but not cruelly. Experience has taught you the difference. You finish by wrapping the final layer with care, then placing your hands gently on the bandage, as if sealing the outcome. You instruct him to rest the arm. He nods. You know he will not. Before leaving, he thanks you, relief washing over his face. This is the part that keeps you doing the job. Not the spells, not the scrolls. This moment, when pain recedes and hope takes its place. As he exits, you make a quick note in your mind. Clean fracture. Set early. Good chances. A strong start. The next patient is already standing in the doorway. The next patient steps forward more cautiously, which immediately worries you. Confident injuries announce themselves. Dangerous ones sneak in politely. She reveals a wound on her leg. Not large, not dramatic, but open. The kind of injury that looks manageable and then quietly ruins everyone's week. You lean closer, inspecting the edges. Redness, swelling, heat. These are signs you recognize, even if you don't yet have a word like infection to curse under your breath. This is the kind of case that separates luck from skill. You clean the wound thoroughly with wine. It stings. She flinches. You do not apologize. Pain means the area is still alive, which is encouraging. The wine washes away dirt, dust, and whatever else decided to take up residence inside her leg. You work carefully, knowing that what you remove now may decide whether she walks away or returns much worse. Next comes honey. You apply it generously, spreading it into the wound and watching it settle. Honey is one of your quiet miracles. You don't know why it works, only that wounds treated with honey heal more often than those that aren't. This is enough. Medicine does not require understanding. It requires results. You add herbs, chosen from experience rather than faith. These reduce swelling, calm irritation, and smell convincingly medicinal. The smell matters. Patients trust things that smell like effort. As you wrap the wound with linen, you speak softly, offering reassurance. You also recite a short spell. Again, not because the wound demands magic, but because fear makes people tense, and tension slows healing. The spell gives the patient something to believe in, while the honey does the real work. You instruct her to keep the wound clean, dry and covered. She nods. You suspect she will do her best. Unlike the labourer with the broken arm, she understands what is at stake. This is the moment you dislike most. Once she leaves, the outcome is no longer entirely in your hands. If the wound worsens, the gods will be blamed. If it heals, the treatment will be praised. You will accept both with professional silence. As she leaves, you clean your hands again, carefully, methodically. You do not rush this part. Wounds have a way of returning if you invite them. You glance toward the doorway. Another patient waits. This one is squinting. The next patient squints before you even ask what's wrong, which in Egypt is usually a strong hint. The land is bright, dusty, and unforgiving. The sun reflects off sand, stone, and water with equal enthusiasm, and the wind carries grit directly into places grit has no business being. Eyes suffer. Constantly. He sits, carefully, blinking as if each movement might offend his face. You ask him to open his eyes wider. He does not enjoy this request. You lean closer, examining the redness, the swelling, the faint discharge. None of this surprises you. If anything, you're surprised more people can still see it all. Eye infections are common, persistent, and deeply irritating. They rarely kill, but they ruin days, weeks, and sometimes lives if ignored. And ignoring them is popular, because people prefer pretending problems will solve themselves. They rarely do. You prepare an ointment made from copper salts, mixed with honey. The copper helps. The honey helps. Why they help is still a mystery, but the results are hard to argue with. You stir carefully, making sure the mixture looks serious and authoritative. Presentation matters when you're about to apply something to someone's eyeball. You warn him that it will sting. He nods bravely. It stings anyway. He flinches, grips the edge of the stool, and mutters something that may or may not be a prayer. You apply the ointment with practiced precision. Too much causes irritation. Too little causes disappointment. You aim for confidence. You instruct him to avoid rubbing his eyes. He nods again. You both know this instruction will be ignored within the hour. Rubbing is irresistible. You say it anyway because it's your duty. You also recite a brief incantation. This serves two purposes. One, it reassures the patient that divine forces are involved. Two, it gives you a moment to let the ointment settle without being blamed for the discomfort. Sometimes these treatments work beautifully. Swelling fades, vision clears, gratitude follows. Other times, the condition lingers. When that happens, it is described as strong, which is ancient medical language for "we tried." Before he leaves, you remind him to return if the pain worsens. He agrees. You suspect he will wait too long, because hope and denial are powerful companions. Once he's gone, you rinse your tools and hands again. Eye work demands cleanliness, even if no one fully understands why. You glance toward the doorway once more. Someone is holding their stomach. This day is not slowing down. The next patient enters already holding their stomach, which is rarely a good sign but extremely common. Stomach problems are the background noise of ancient life. If someone is not bleeding, coughing, or squinting, they are probably nauseous. You invite him to sit. He does so carefully, as if his insides might fall out if he moves too quickly. He explains the symptoms in detail: cramping, discomfort, and a deep sense of betrayal by his own body. You listen patiently, nodding at the appropriate moments. This part is important. People feel better when someone appears confident about their suffering. The cause is rarely mysterious. Too much beer, bread that was stored too long, water drawn from a place that should not be named. Sometimes all three. Egypt provides food abundantly, but it also provides opportunities for digestive regret. You consult your remedies. Stomach treatments are more about balance than cure. Herbs to calm the gut. Instructions to rest. Advice to avoid certain foods that the patient will absolutely eat again tomorrow. You prepare a mixture designed to soothe rather than punish, which is already an improvement over some earlier traditions. You explain the treatment carefully. You tell him to drink the mixture slowly. You tell him to avoid heavy food. You tell him to rest. He nods, clearly planning to do exactly one of those things, and even then, only briefly. You also offer a short prayer. Not because the stomach requires divine intervention, but because stomach pain makes people anxious, and anxiety makes stomach pain worse. This is an observation you have made repeatedly, even if you don't have a scroll explaining it. As he leaves, you remind him to return if the pain worsens. He thanks you, relieved to have an explanation, even if the explanation is, your bread betrayed you. You wash your hands again. Stomach cases require caution. They also require patience. Some improve quickly, some linger. Some return after the patient ignores every instruction you gave them and drinks questionable beer with friends. You glance toward the doorway. Another person waits. This one looks uncomfortable in a way that suggests either fever or embarrassment. Possibly both. You take a breath. The day continues. The next patient hesitates at the doorway, which immediately tells you this is not a simple case. Straightforward injuries walk in confidently. Magical ones hover. He finally steps forward and lowers his voice, as if illness might overhear him. He explains his symptoms carefully: fatigue, strange dreams, a sense that something is wrong in a way that refuses to be specific. Nothing hurts exactly. Nothing looks broken. Everything feels off. This is the moment when medicine politely hands the problem to religion and says, "You take this one." You listen without interrupting. You've learned that these cases require respect. If you dismiss them, the patient will leave unconvinced. If you panic, everyone else will panic too. You nod slowly, examining him while also examining the situation. There is no wound to clean, no bone to set, no eye to ointment. This is imbalance. In ancient Egypt, imbalance is serious business. You consult with a priest, because this is how things work. Medicine and magic are not rivals here. They are co-workers. Sometimes medicine leads. Sometimes magic takes the front. Often, they walk side by side, pretending not to judge each other. The priest suggests divine displeasure. You suggest exhaustion and poor diet. Both explanations are accepted. You prepare a treatment that satisfies everyone involved. Herbs for the body, ritual words for the soul, and instructions to rest, which will be ignored immediately. You recite a spell with professional seriousness. The words are ancient, comforting, and deliberately vague. Vague spells age better. The patient relaxes visibly. This alone may help more than the herbs. You give him a charm to carry, not because you believe the charm will cure him, but because belief is powerful, and people heal better when they feel protected. Also, it prevents him from returning tomorrow asking why he still feels strange. As he leaves, you feel the familiar tension lift slightly. These cases drain energy. There is no clear outcome, no satisfying conclusion, just effort. You make a mental note. Patterns matter. If more people arrive with similar complaints, you will adjust your approach. This is how knowledge grows, not through certainty, but through repetition. You wash your hands again, because ritual applies to doctors too. Outside, the sun is climbing higher. Heat presses in. More people gather. And somewhere in the crowd, a child begins to cry. You already know what that means. The sound of a crying child cuts through the day faster than any announcement. Adults complain. Children announce emergencies. You straighten instinctively, already preparing yourself for a situation where emotions will arrive before symptoms. A parent rushes in, carrying a child who is hot to the touch and far too quiet between sobs. Fever. Always worrying. Fevers in children are unpredictable, stubborn, and deeply unfair. You place a hand on the child's forehead, feeling the heat radiate back at you like a warning. You examine carefully, skin, eyes, breathing. You ask gentle questions. How long has this lasted? What has the child eaten? Has anything changed recently? The parent answers quickly, anxiously, sometimes contradicting themselves. This is normal. Fear makes memory unreliable. You prepare a treatment designed to cool and soothe. Light herbal mixtures, gentle applications, nothing harsh. Children are not small adults. You have learned this the hard way. What helps a grown labourer could overwhelm a child completely. You speak softly while working, because calm spreads. Children respond to tone long before they understand words. The child relaxes slightly. This feels like progress. You do not celebrate yet. Parents watch your every movement. They are silent now, holding their breath, as if noise itself might break the spell. You are aware of their trust. It weighs more than any diagnosis. You recite a short prayer, not theatrically, quietly. This is not performance. This is reassurance for the parents, for the child, and for yourself. You do not know how this will end. Anyone who says they do is lying. You instruct the parents to keep the child cool, hydrated, and watched closely. You tell them what signs to look for. You tell them when to return. You repeat yourself. Parents under stress forget instructions immediately. When they leave, you stand still for a moment longer than usual. Child cases linger. They follow you through the rest of the day, living in the back of your thoughts. You wash your hands again. Slowly, carefully. This is not habit, it is grounding. Outside, the crying has stopped. This is good, for now. You glance toward the doorway. Another patient waits. This one smells like animals, which usually means trouble. The next patient announces himself before speaking. He smells like animals, sweat, and a life spent making decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. This usually means one thing: an injury acquired while working with something that had horns, hooves, or opinions. You examine him carefully. There is swelling, there is bruising, there is pain that does not line up neatly with anything visible. This is where medicine becomes uncomfortable. Not everything presents clearly. Not every problem gives you the courtesy of a simple explanation. You ask questions. How did it happen? When did it start? Did it hurt immediately or later? The answers are vague, contradictory, and occasionally heroic. You nod anyway. Patients do not come for judgment. They come for reassurance that their body has not permanently betrayed them. You palpate the area gently, watching his face more than the injury. Pain tells you more than words. Nothing feels broken. Nothing feels torn. But something is wrong. This is the dangerous middle ground, where experience replaces certainty. You explain that rest is required. This is rarely popular. You apply a poultice meant to reduce swelling and bind the area carefully. You do not promise a quick recovery. Promises are how doctors lose credibility. This is one of those cases where outcome depends on things you cannot control. Will he rest? Probably not. Will the swelling go down? Maybe. Will he return tomorrow insisting it is worse? Almost certainly. You are aware always of the limits of what you know. Ancient Egyptian medicine is advanced for its time, but it is not magic. You cannot see inside the body. You cannot fight infection once it spreads. You work with observation, repetition, and experience. This is not ignorance. It is realism. Some illnesses resolve on their own. Some do not. Some respond beautifully to treatment. Others stubbornly ignore everything you do. The difference is not always obvious. You make a mental note of the symptoms. You store them away. If another patient arrives with similar complaints, you will connect the dots. This is how knowledge grows. Slowly, quietly, without applause. As the man leaves, he thanks you. You accept it politely, knowing that gratitude does not guarantee recovery. Still, it matters. You wash your hands again. Not because you believe it controls outcomes, but because it gives you the illusion of order in a world that resists it. You glance outside. The day is moving toward afternoon. The heat is rising. The cases will change. And you are only halfway through. By the time the afternoon heat settles in, you do something that quietly separates you from guesswork healers and enthusiastic amateurs. You write things down. Not dramatically, not poetically, carefully, methodically. Like someone who has learned that memory lies, but ink usually doesn't. You unroll a sheet of papyrus and review the day so far. Broken arm, clean fracture. Set early. Good outcome expected, assuming the patient ignores your instructions in a reasonable way rather than an ambitious one. Wound treated with honey. Eye infection addressed. Stomach complaints noted. Child with fever. Watch closely. These notes are not for storytelling. They are for survival. Egyptian medicine takes record-keeping seriously. Every remedy you use has history behind it. Someone tried it before. Someone lived long enough to say, yes, that helped, or quietly disappeared from the records. Either way, lessons were learned. You copy remedies carefully, preserving wording exactly. Changing phrasing carelessly is how spells stop working and treatments lose credibility. Precision matters, even when you don't fully understand why. This is where medicine starts to feel less mystical and more professional. You notice patterns. Certain wounds heal faster with honey. Certain fevers respond to cooling treatments. Certain stomach pains reliably follow bad beer and bad decisions. You don't have theories. You have observations. And observations are powerful. Writing also gives you a moment to breathe. Patients are loud. Paper is quiet. Ink does not interrupt you with new symptoms halfway through a sentence. For a brief stretch of time, you are alone with your thoughts, your notes, and the comforting illusion that the day is under control. You pause occasionally to sharpen your reed pen, blowing away fibres and wondering how something so small ends up deciding how clearly future doctors understand today. Knowledge survives because someone took the time to write instead of rushing to the next emergency. You glance up occasionally. The doorway remains active. People come and go. The day does not wait for documentation. But you persist anyway. Because this slow accumulation of experience is how medicine advances, even when no one notices. When you finish, you roll the papyrus carefully and set it aside. These notes may help you tomorrow, or next season, or long after you are gone. That thought is quietly comforting. You wash your hands again, stand, and prepare to face the next wave. The afternoon is not finished with you yet. As the afternoon stretches on, the work changes. Not in difficulty, but in tone. The early cases were urgent, loud, and obvious. Now come the ones that linger, the people who return, hovering in the doorway, unsure whether they are bothering you or saving themselves. A familiar face appears. Someone you treated earlier. They are not worse, but they are not better either. This is the most uncomfortable outcome. Improvement is celebrated. Decline is mourned. Stagnation simply stares at you, waiting. You examine them again, carefully, quietly, resisting the urge to rush. This is where responsibility presses hardest. They are watching you not just for treatment, but for reassurance that they were right to trust you in the first place. Being a doctor in ancient Egypt means carrying an invisible ledger. Every success adds weight. Every failure adds more. There is no way to set it down. You do not get to say, "I am tired," or "this is beyond me," even when it is. You simply adjust your tone, refine your approach, and try again. You change the treatment slightly, a different herb, a different application, a longer rest recommendation that will still be ignored, but feels morally necessary to say. You explain calmly, confidently. Doubt spreads faster than illness. People expect certainty from you. They believe that knowledge looks like confidence, not hesitation. So you do not hesitate, even when you are thinking very carefully. The patient leaves again, hopeful enough to keep going. You remain, sitting still for a moment longer than usual. These are the cases that follow you home, the ones without dramatic beginnings or endings, the ones that depend on time, luck, and whether the universe feels cooperative. You glance at your tools. They are the same as this morning. Simple, honest, limited. You work within those limits every day, and you do not resent them. Limits define the work. Outside, voices rise and fall. The city moves on. People live, argue, eat, and make decisions that will eventually bring them back to your doorway. You wash your hands again, not out of habit, but because it feels like resetting something internal. A pause between responsibility and action. There are still patients waiting, and they believe you can help. That belief is heavier than any tool you carry. Just when you think the day might slow down, it does the opposite. The afternoon brings a second wave of patients, not because illness follows schedules, but because people spend the morning ignoring problems and the afternoon admitting defeat. The first arrives with a bite. Animal bites are never good news. This one comes from a goat, which is somehow both impressive and concerning. Goats, you have learned, bite with enthusiasm and zero remorse. You inspect the wound carefully. Teeth marks, broken skin, redness already forming. You feel the familiar tightening in your chest that says, "This could go badly if we're unlucky." You clean the wound thoroughly. Wine first. The patient hisses. You apply honey. The patient relaxes. Honey has that effect on wounds and morale. You bind the area firmly and remind him to keep it clean. He promises. You have heard promises before. Next comes a cut from a farming tool, then a burn, then swelling from a fall that was not that serious until it very clearly was. None of these injuries are dramatic on their own. Together they form the steady rhythm of a working society, slowly injuring itself in predictable ways. You move efficiently now. The hesitation of morning is gone. Your hands know what to do before your thoughts finish forming. Clean, apply, bind, reassure, repeat. This is not rushing. It is experience settling in. The heat presses harder as the sun lowers. Sweat sticks to your skin. The room smells of herbs, linen, and human anxiety. You drink water when you remember to. You remind yourself to eat later. Hunger can wait. People cannot. One patient arrives too late. Not dying, but worse. Infection has already spread. The skin is hot, the swelling angry. You do what you can, knowing full well that outcomes are uncertain. You do not lie. You speak carefully. Honesty delivered gently is its own kind of treatment. Between patients, you adjust supplies. More bandages, less honey. Always less honey than you would like. You silently thank the bees for their ongoing cooperation. The line outside finally begins to thin. Voices fade. Footsteps retreat. You realize you have been standing for longer than feels reasonable. This part of the day is exhausting, not because the work is hard, but because the stakes never change. Every person matters equally. There are no small cases when you are the only option. As the last patient leaves, you pause, leaning against the wall. The rush is over. The consequences, however, will unfold overnight, and tomorrow morning you will hear about them. As the flow of patients finally slows, you do something deceptively simple. You clean, not hurriedly, not carelessly, thoroughly, deliberately, as if the act itself is part of the medicine. In ancient Egypt, cleanliness is not a preference, it is a principle. Order must be restored at the end of the day, or chaos will happily linger. You wash your hands again, even though you have already washed them countless times. Water runs over skin that feels older than it did this morning. You scrub beneath your nails, rinse away dried honey, resin, and whatever else the day decided to leave behind. You do not know about microbes, but you know that clean hands feel right, and rightness matters. You clean your tools next. Copper blades wiped carefully, wooden splints set back in place, linen bandages folded, sorted, and quietly judged for whether they can be reused without tempting fate. Jars are sealed. Herbs are returned to their containers. Nothing is left out. Disorder invites mistakes tomorrow. This process is calming, predictable. Unlike patience, tools behave. You also perform small rituals, nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical. A quiet word of thanks, a brief acknowledgement of the gods, not begging, not bargaining, just recognition. The day could have gone worse. That is worth acknowledging. Cleanliness, in Egyptian thought, is tied to mate, cosmic balance. You may not control outcomes, but you can control your actions. You can end the day with order instead of exhaustion-fueled chaos. That matters more than it sounds. As you work, the noise outside softens. The city shifts into evening, voices lower, footsteps slow. Somewhere someone is cooking. Somewhere else, someone is regretting a decision that will bring them back to you tomorrow. You take a moment to sit. Not collapse, sit. There is a difference. You stretch your hands, roll your shoulders, and feel the quiet weight of the day settle in. Not crushing, just present. This part of the job is invisible. No one thanks you for clean tools. No one applauds folded linen. But tomorrow's success depends on what you do now. You finish, stand, and look around your workspace. It is ready again. Reset, balanced. The day is almost over, but before rest comes reflection, because the mind, unlike the body, does not turn off easily, and you still have one more thing to face. As evening settles in, the world grows quieter, but your mind does not follow instructions. Bodies may rest, but thoughts have a habit of pacing. You sit alone for a moment, letting the sounds of the city fade into something manageable, and take stock of the day you just survived. Some patients improved. You can feel it. The labourer with the broken arm will sleep tonight without sharp pain. The woman with the wound has a chance. The child's fever might break. These are victories, even if no one announces them. You allow yourself a small, private nod. Nothing dramatic. Doctors who celebrate too loudly invite disappointment. Other cases linger in your thoughts. The swelling that might worsen. The infection that arrived too late. The patient who promised to rest with a tone that suggested they absolutely would not. These are not failures, not yet, but they carry weight. Medicine does not offer clean endings. It offers probabilities and patience. You offer thanks to the gods, but not in the way people imagine. This is not begging or bargaining. You are not asking for miracles. You are acknowledging endurance, yours and theirs. Gratitude without expectation. Appreciation without illusion. You have learned that hope is useful, but certainty is dangerous. People believe doctors have answers. What you actually have are tools, experience, and the discipline to keep trying even when outcomes refuse to cooperate. That truth does not disappoint you anymore. It grounds you. You think briefly about the trust placed in you. How easily people step into your space, expose their pain, and hand you responsibility for outcomes you cannot fully control. It is humbling. It is exhausting. It is quietly extraordinary. You also think about tomorrow, because there will be one. There always is, until there isn't. More patience, more decisions, more moments where you must appear confident while thinking very carefully. the work never really ends. It only pauses long enough for sleep. You rise, stretch slowly, and prepare to leave your workspace. Tools are clean, notes are written, balance is restored as much as it can be. This is as close to closure as medicine allows. Outside, the sky darkens, lamps glow, families gather. Somewhere, someone feels better because of something you did today, even if they never fully understand why. You allow yourself one last thought before rest claims you. You did what you could. And in this world, that matters. Tomorrow, you will do it again. Night finally arrives, and with it, permission to stop being needed for a few precious hours. You lie down on your mat, body tired in a way that feels earned, and allow the darkness to settle. This is the part of the day no one sees. No patience, no prayers, no expectations. Just you, your thoughts, and the echo of everything that passed through your hands. You are aware, even now, of where you stand in history, though not in the grand, dramatic way future scholars might imagine. You do not think of yourself as a pioneer. You think of yourself as someone doing a job that must be done. But in truth, you are standing at the very beginning of medicine as a discipline. You observe. You record. You test what works and quietly discard what doesn't. You rely on experience more than superstition, even when superstition surrounds you. You understand the body not as a mystery to fear, but as a system, imperfect, fragile, but often surprisingly resilient. This does not make you all-powerful. Far from it. Some patients will not recover. Some illnesses will defy everything you know. And tomorrow you will feel that familiar knot in your chest again when someone arrives too late or suffers too deeply. Medicine does not spare you from helplessness. It teaches you how to live with it. Still, you make a difference. Not through miracles, but through consistency. Through showing up. Through treating pain seriously even when answers are incomplete. Through refusing to surrender to chaos, even when chaos is loud, insistent, and wearing a convincing disguise. You smile faintly at the irony. Thousands of years from now, people will call what you do primitive, while quietly benefiting from the foundation you help build. They will forget the uncertainty, the pressure, the human weight of it. They will remember the progress. And that is fine. You close your eyes knowing that tomorrow someone will wake up healthier because of you. Someone else will simply feel less afraid. Both outcomes matter. Sleep comes slowly, but honestly. Because today, you are not a magician. You are not a priest pretending to heal. You are not guessing. You are a professional, working with the best tools available to you, guided by observation, discipline, and care. And in a world still learning how bodies work, that is no small thing. Tomorrow, before the sun rises, you will wake again, and medicine will begin all over. Long before people carried documents, wore uniforms, or even shared a common written language, hair functioned as one of humanity's earliest identity systems. In the ancient world, your hairstyle spoke for you the moment you entered a space. It told others whether you were free or owned, powerful or humble, married or available, sacred or dangerous. Hair was not decoration first. It was information. Unlike clothing, which could be changed or stolen, hair was intimate. It grew slowly, required care, and reflected time, status, and discipline. To cut it, braid it, or cover it was a deliberate act. And because hair sits at the very top of the body, framing the face, ancient societies treated it as a symbolic extension of the self. Who you were began at your scalp. In many early cultures, hair marked the boundary between order and chaos. Unbound hair often signaled grief, madness, ritual possession, or rebellion. Controlled hair, braided, bound, shaved, or covered, signaled conformity and belonging. This is why so many ancient laws, religious rules, and social customs focused obsessively on hair. It was not vanity, it was control. Hair also functioned as a visible timeline. Long hair suggested youth, freedom, or spiritual power. Shaved or cropped hair could mean punishment, mourning, servitude, or military discipline. A single cut could change how the world treated you overnight. In some societies, losing your hair was worse than losing property. It meant losing identity. Gender roles were also written in hair. Length, texture, and styling separated male from female, adult from child. Crossing those boundaries, intentionally or not, was often seen as threatening. A woman cutting her hair short, or a man wearing elaborate styling, could unsettle social order, not because of fashion, but because it blurred categories that ancient societies depended on for stability. Importantly, hair was public. You could not hide it easily. That made it perfect for signalling loyalty, faith, and obedience. Rulers understood this. Priests understood this. Even parents understood this. From early childhood, people learned how their hair should look, when it should be cut, and what it meant when it was not. This chapter sets the foundation for everything that follows. Because once hair became a language, it could be manipulated. It could elevate, humiliate, protect, or condemn. And in the ancient world, the story of hair is not about beauty. It is about power, identity, and who was allowed to belong. In ancient Egypt, hair was never just hair. It was architecture, ritual, and performance woven together. Most Egyptians, especially those who could afford it, did not wear their natural hair in public at all. Instead, they shaved their heads and replaced their hair with carefully crafted wigs. This was not done for disguise, but for control. The Egyptian climate made shaved heads practical, but the wig transformed practicality into status. Wigs were built from human hair, plant fibres, wool, and even palm fibres, layered and styled into precise shapes. The quality of a wig immediately revealed a person's place in society. Fine wigs were heavy, scented with oils, and meticulously curled. Cheaper wigs were lighter, simpler, and less durable. The head became a billboard of rank. For elites, wigs were not optional. They were part of the public body. Officials, priests, and members of the royal court were expected to appear composed, symmetrical, and controlled. The wig helped achieve this ideal. It erased unruly natural hair and replaced it with something ordered and deliberate. To wear a wig was to declare that you had mastered yourself. Priests took this logic even further. Many shaved not only their heads, but their entire bodies before entering temples. Hair was considered chaotic, animal, and earthly. Removing it was an act of purification. A smooth scalp meant closeness to the divine. In this context, hairlessness signaled spiritual discipline, not shame. At the royal level, hair became overt propaganda. Pharaohs often wore stylized wigs combined with ceremonial headdresses. These were not meant to look natural. They were meant to look eternal. The hairstyle did not change with age, emotion, or circumstance. It presented the ruler as timeless, unchanging, and divinely sanctioned. Even false beards, attached and braided, were worn by both male and female rulers to visually claim authority. Children, interestingly, were marked differently. Many elite children wore shaved heads, except for a single side lock of hair. This hairstyle publicly announced youth and dependence. When the side lock was cut, it marked a transition into adulthood and responsibility. Again, hair acted as a social signal, not a personal choice. In Egypt, hair was not about self-expression. It was about performing your role correctly. To wear the wrong hair in the wrong space was not a fashion mistake. It was a social error. And through wigs, the Egyptians showed one of the earliest examples of hair being used to construct power rather than reflect nature. To outsiders, Viking hair looked untamed, fierce, and almost animalistic. Long beards, braided hair, and dramatic styles helped cement the image of the Viking as a wild northern warrior. But this reputation hides a quieter truth. Viking hair was not chaotic at all. It was deliberate, maintained, and deeply symbolic. Archaeological finds, comb discoveries, and contemporary accounts all point to the same conclusion. Vikings cared intensely about grooming. Combs were among the most common personal items found in Viking graves, sometimes buried alongside weapons. Hair was washed regularly, often weekly, which was unusually frequent by early medieval standards. Braiding was not just decorative, it was functional. Braids kept hair out of the face during work and battle, reduced lice, and prevented tangling during long voyages. But braids also carried meaning. For men, long hair and full beards signalled strength, maturity, and honour. A slave or a punished man might have his hair cut short as a mark of humiliation. To lose one's hair was to lose dignity. Warriors styled their hair before battle not simply to intimidate enemies, but to enter the correct mental state. Hair became part of the ritual of readiness. Women's hair carried even sharper social signals. Unmarried women often wore their hair loose or lightly styled, while married women braided, bound, or covered their hair. These styles announced availability, loyalty, and household status without a word spoken. Hair was a visible contract with society. To wear it incorrectly could invite suspicion or shame. Interestingly, the wild Viking look was partly intentional theatre. Foreign observers, especially Christian chroniclers, exaggerated Viking appearance to emphasize their otherness. Vikings themselves understood this reputation and sometimes leaned into it. Elaborate braids, shaved sides, and dramatic beards could project fear and dominance, especially during raids or negotiations. Hair became psychological warfare. Children again were marked through hair. Young boys and girls wore simpler styles, with hair length increasing with age. The transition into adulthood often came with a new hairstyle, marking readiness for responsibility, marriage, or warfare. These changes were not casual. They were communal acknowledgements of growth. What appears at first glance to be raw nature was in fact controlled identity. Viking hair balanced cleanliness and ferocity, order and intimidation. It allowed individuals to signal strength without speaking and belonging without paperwork. In a world where reputation travelled faster than written records, hair helped ensure that when a Viking entered a room, or stepped off a ship, everyone knew exactly what kind of person had arrived. In ancient Rome, hair was political. It reflected not only personal status, but moral character, civic virtue, and loyalty to the state. Romans believed that a well-ordered society required well-ordered bodies, and hair sat at the centre of that belief. To look Roman was to wear your hair correctly. For Roman men, simplicity was power. Short, controlled hair signalled discipline and seriousness. Excessive styling was viewed with suspicion, associated with foreigners, decadence, or moral weakness. A respectable Roman citizen kept his hair neat and modest, mirroring the ideals of self-restraint and rational control that defined Roman masculinity. When Julius Caesar began wearing his hair combed forward to hide baldness, it was quietly tolerated only because of his unmatched authority. For others, such vanity could ruin reputations. Beards tell an important story here. Early Romans were clean-shaven, seeing facial hair as barbaric. Later, during periods of Greek influence, beards returned as symbols of philosophy and intellect. The face became a cultural battleground. Shaving or not shaving was no longer just grooming. It was alignment with an idea of Rome. Women's hair was even more strictly regulated. Hairstyles communicated marital status, wealth, and moral virtue. Elaborate coiffures involving braids, curls, and hairpieces became fashionable among elite women during the empire. These styles required enslaved hairdressers, hours of labour, and imported hair. Complexity itself became a status symbol. The higher and more intricate the hairstyle, the clearer the message. This woman belonged to the elite. But with visibility came scrutiny. Roman moralists often attacked fashionable hairstyles as signs of excess and corruption. A woman's hair was expected to reflect modesty and loyalty to her household. Loose or uncovered hair could imply sexual impropriety, grief, or rebellion. Even widows were expected to alter their hair as a public sign of mourning. Hair also marked punishment and exclusion. Slaves were often cropped or shaved to make their status immediately visible. Criminals and adulteresses could have their hair cut as public humiliation. In Rome, hair could be taken away to strip a person of dignity faster than any legal document. Perhaps most revealing is how quickly hair changed during crisis. During times of mourning or political chaos, Romans let their hair grow wild. Order dissolved on the body before it returned to the streets. When stability was restored, hair was cut again. In Rome, then, hair was not a private matter. It was a public declaration of obedience, morality, and belonging. To wear it incorrectly was not rebellious fashion. It was social danger. In ancient and early classical Japan, hair was treated as something closer to a moral extension of the body than a simple physical feature. It reflected discipline, hierarchy, and one's relationship to society. Unlike cultures that emphasized cutting or reshaping hair, Japanese traditions focused on control, restraint, and continuity. Hair was not meant to shout, it was meant to signal refinement. For much of Japanese history, especially among the aristocracy, hair was worn long. Both men and women allowed their hair to grow, often straight and carefully maintained. Length itself carried meaning. Long, healthy hair suggested self-discipline, lineage, and stability. Cutting it without cause could be seen as a form of social rupture. Hair was not casually altered, it was altered with intent. Court women are the clearest example. Elite women wore extremely long hair, sometimes reaching the floor. This was not practical, and that was precisely the point. The length communicated leisure, status, and insulation from manual labour. Maintaining such hair required servants, oils, combing rituals, and constant attention. Hair became a visible measure of privilege and refinement. Men's hair also followed strict codes. Styles changed with rank, occupation, and era, but the underlying principle remained the same. Hair must reflect order. Certain hairstyles marked adulthood, while others signaled youth or service. The act of styling hair was often ritualized, performed slowly and deliberately. Rushed or careless grooming implied moral laxity. Religion added another layer. In Buddhist tradition, shaving the head symbolized renunciation of worldly attachments. When a man or woman became a monk or nun, the cutting of hair was not just symbolic, it was transformative. Identity was shed, strand by strand. The head became a visible statement of spiritual withdrawal. This act carried enormous weight because hair was so closely tied to personal and social identity. Hair could also mark disgrace. Being forced to cut one's hair outside accepted ritual contexts could signify punishment or shame. Because hair symbolized continuity and self-mastery, its removal disrupted that narrative. The person was visually marked as having fallen out of alignment with social expectations. What makes Japanese hair culture distinctive is its quietness. There was little emphasis on dramatic display or intimidation. Instead, hair communicated inner discipline. The message was subtle but powerful. A controlled exterior reflected a controlled mind. In this way, hair became part of a broader cultural philosophy. Order began with the self began with the body, and the body, very often, began with how one treated their hair. Because hair carried so much meaning in the ancient world, altering it against custom became one of the most powerful tools of control. When societies wanted to punish, humiliate, or erase someone's identity without killing them, they often began with the hair. Cutting it, shaving it, or forcing it into the wrong style was a way to publicly rewrite who a person was allowed to be. In many cultures, forced hair removal marked disgrace. Slaves, captives, and criminals were commonly shaved to make their lowered status instantly visible. This was not about hygiene, it was about visibility. A shaved head told everyone that this person had lost autonomy. They no longer belonged fully to themselves. Their body had been claimed by the state, a household, or a conqueror. For women, hair-based punishment carried an added layer of sexual and moral judgment. Cutting a woman's hair could symbolize the loss of honor, modesty, or marital legitimacy. Because hair was closely tied to femininity and virtue, removing it publicly acted as a form of social exile. The punishment lingered. hair takes time to grow back, meaning shame was prolonged and unavoidable. Rebellion, however, often used the same language in reverse. Refusing to wear the approved hairstyle became a quiet form of resistance. Letting hair grow when it should be cut, or cutting it when it should be long, challenged authority without words. In rigid societies, these small acts could be deeply threatening. They signaled that a person no longer accepted the rules governing identity. Religious dissent also appeared through hair. Individuals rejecting dominant beliefs sometimes altered their hair to mark separation from the community. This was risky. Looking different made one vulnerable, but it also made conviction visible. Hair became a banner for belief. Even mourning disrupted hair norms. In many ancient societies, grief justified disorder. People let their hair grow wild, tore it out, or neglected grooming entirely. This temporary rejection of control mirrored the emotional collapse caused by loss. Society allowed this exception because it recognized that hair reflected inner order, and grief shattered it. What makes hair such an effective tool of punishment or rebellion is its immediacy. You could not hide it easily. You could not argue it away. The body itself became the message. That is why rulers regulated hair and rebels targeted it. It sat at the intersection of visibility, identity, and time. In the ancient world, to control hair was to control how a person existed in public. And when that control was broken, by force or by choice, it revealed just how fragile social order really was. In the ancient world, hair was one of the clearest ways societies tracked a person's movement through life. Childhood, adulthood, marriage, maturity, and even approaching death were often marked not by documents or ceremonies alone, but by visible changes in hair. A single cut could announce that someone had crossed a threshold and could never return. Children's hair was rarely treated the same as adults. In many cultures, it was left unstyled, partially shaved, or marked with distinctive locks. These styles openly signaled dependence and incompleteness. A child was not yet fully a social being. Hair communicated that status instantly. The moment it changed, the child's relationship to the community changed with it. Coming-of-age rituals almost always involved hair. Cutting, braiding, shaving, or restyling marked the transition into responsibility. This act was rarely private. It was witnessed, acknowledged, and remembered. Hair served as proof that time had passed and expectations had shifted. Afterward, the individual was treated differently, spoken to differently, and judged by new standards. Marriage brought some of the most dramatic hair transformations, especially for women. Hairstyles often shifted from loose or youthful arrangements to controlled, bound, or covered forms. These changes publicly declared loyalty, sexual exclusivity, and incorporation into a household. The hair told strangers what questions were no longer appropriate to ask. It set boundaries without confrontation. Men, too, experienced age-marked hair changes. Beards, in particular, often symbolized maturity and authority. A beardless man might be viewed as incomplete or untested, while a full beard could command respect. When age eventually thinned or whitened hair, it carried meaning of its own. Grey hair signaled experience, endurance, and proximity to wisdom, or decline, depending on the culture. Old age sometimes brought deliberate hair alteration. Elders might simplify their hairstyles or allow them to grow naturally, stepping away from the visual competition of youth. In certain traditions, neglecting hair was not seen as failure, but as acceptance. Identity softened as time narrowed. Even death was anticipated through hair. The elderly might cut or arrange their hair differently as a quiet preparation. Mourners altered their hair to mirror the rupture death caused in the living. Once again, hair tracked life's most profound changes. Across cultures, hair functioned as a living timeline. It changed when a person's role changed. It made time visible on the body. And in societies without clocks or birth certificates, Hair helped everyone understand exactly where someone stood in the long passage of a human life. In the ancient world, hair was one of the fastest ways to identify who did not belong. Long before accents were heard or customs observed, hair announced difference. Its length, texture, colour and styling could immediately mark someone as foreign, suspicious or dangerous. Hair became a visual border. Every culture developed a sense of what normal hair looked like, and anything outside that standard drew attention. Greeks and Romans, for example, often described foreign peoples first by their hair: too long, too wild, too curled, too decorated. These descriptions were not neutral. They framed outsiders as excessive, undisciplined, or uncivilized. Hair became evidence in an unspoken trial. This fear worked both ways. Foreigners entering new lands were often pressured to alter their hair to blend in. Cutting it differently, shaving it, or styling it according to local norms was a survival strategy. To keep one's native hairstyle was to risk harassment, exclusion, or worse. Assimilation often began at the scalp. Conquerors understood the symbolic power of hair immediately. When empires expanded, they frequently imposed hair rules on conquered populations. This was not accidental. Forcing people to abandon traditional hairstyles weakened cultural memory. It erased visual continuity between generations. A child who no longer wore their people's hair no longer fully carried their identity. At the same time, resistance often clung to hair stubbornly. Maintaining traditional hairstyles became an act of quiet defiance. Even when language, clothing, or religion changed under pressure, hair sometimes remained untouched. It was harder to legislate and slower to erase. A braid, a knot, or a curl could preserve ancestry in plain sight. Hair also played a role in stereotyping enemies. Warriors were described as terrifying, partly because of how they wore their hair: spiked, braided, loose, or adorned. These images were exaggerated and repeated until hairstyle itself became shorthand for threat. Over time, fear attached itself not to actions, but to appearance. Interestingly, admiration followed fear closely. Exotic hairstyles could fascinate just as much as they unsettled. Elites sometimes adopted foreign hair fashions to signal worldliness or power over distant lands. What began as fear could become fashion once dominance was established. In this way, hair sat at the edge of identity and prejudice. It marked who belonged and who did not, who was familiar and who was suspect. In ancient societies obsessed with order, hair helped draw the line between us and them, often before a single word was exchanged. When ancient people looked at hair, they were not only seeing the present, they were seeing the past and the future layered together. Hair carried memory. It preserved traditions long after rulers fell, borders shifted, and languages changed. While buildings crumbled and texts were lost, hairstyles often survived, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Unlike laws or monuments, hair traditions lived on the body. Parents styled their children's hair the way they had been taught. Elders corrected younger generations when styles drifted too far. In this way, hair became a form of unspoken education. You learned who you were by how your hair was touched, tied, or cut. Memory was transmitted through hands, not books. This is why hairstyles often outlasted the cultures that created them. Even after conquest or cultural collapse, certain braids, knots, or rituals remained. They became fragments of identity that resisted erasure. To outsiders, they might look like habits. To those within the culture, they were anchors. A familiar hairstyle could reconnect someone to ancestors they never met. Hair also stored personal history. Scars on the scalp, changes in texture, or uneven growth told stories of illness, hardship, or survival. For ancient people, the body was an archive. Hair marked seasons of life, moments of loss, and times of stability. Cutting it was sometimes delayed precisely because it meant letting go of memory. In some traditions, hair was preserved after death, kept as relics, buried with care, or treated ritually. This practice reflected a belief that hair retained part of the self. Even when the body was gone, the hair still knew who the person had been. Identity lingered in strands. Perhaps most striking is how little ancient people spoke explicitly about hair, despite its importance. It was everywhere and therefore invisible in language. Its meanings were understood without explanation. Everyone knew what certain styles meant. That shared understanding gave hair its power. Looking back, ancient hairstyles function like a silent historical record. They reveal values that texts often ignore: fears about disorder, obsessions with control, ideals of beauty tied to morality, and deep anxieties about belonging. Through hair, we glimpse how ancient people experienced themselves in the world. In the end, hair was never just an accessory. It was a living symbol, growing, changing, remembering. And across the ancient world, identity quite literally took shape one strand at a time. In the middle of the 19th century, Alaska was not viewed as a prize. It was viewed as a mistake waiting to happen. To most Americans, the territory existed only as a vague shape on a map, a frozen mass hovering above the continent with no clear purpose. It was distant, unfamiliar, and overwhelmingly cold. There were no cities anyone had heard of, no farms to imagine, no roads to picture. Alaska felt less like land and more like a rumour. The timing could not have been worse. The United States had just survived the Civil War, a conflict that drained its economy, fractured its politics, and left deep social wounds. The federal government was focused on reconstruction, reunification, and survival. Against that backdrop, the idea of spending millions on an icy wilderness sounded not just foolish, but insulting. Critics asked why the nation should invest in snow when its own people were struggling. Popular newspapers ridiculed the concept relentlessly. Editorial cartoons showed polar bears wandering through American streets. Commentators joked that the territory was fit only for seals and ice. Alaska was framed as useless space, too cold for agriculture, too isolated for trade, and too empty to justify the cost of governing it. There was no gold rush yet, no oil, no strategic radar installations to change the conversation. All of that lay decades in the future. Geography made things worse. Alaska sat far from Washington, disconnected from the rest of the country, and dangerously close to British Canada. Some feared it would become a permanent military burden, requiring protection from foreign powers without offering anything in return. Others worried it would provoke diplomatic tension with Britain at a time when the United States could not afford another international conflict. Even the language used to describe Alaska betrayed the mindset of the era. It was called barren, desolate, empty, despite being home to indigenous peoples who had lived there for thousands of years. Their presence was largely ignored in public debate. From the American imagination, Alaska was not a homeland. It was a blank space. So when talk of acquiring the territory began to circulate, many assumed it was a joke or a political distraction. No one yet saw Alaska as opportunity. At that moment in history, it was simply a frozen question mark, one that most Americans were perfectly content to leave unanswered. If Americans saw Alaska as worthless, Russia saw it as a growing problem. By the 1860s, the Russian Empire no longer viewed its North American territory as an asset, but as a liability stretched too far from the center of power. Alaska was expensive to maintain, difficult to defend, and increasingly vulnerable in a world where empires were beginning to collide. Russia's presence in Alaska had always been thin. A handful of trading posts, missionaries and company outposts stretched across an enormous and unforgiving landscape. Supplying them required long, dangerous sea routes. Communication with St. Petersburg took months. Any serious military defense would have required massive investment, and Russia simply did not have the resources to spare. Recent history had sharpened that fear. The Crimean War had exposed Russia's military weaknesses, especially at sea. British naval power loomed large, and Russian officials knew an uncomfortable truth. If war broke out again, Alaska would be impossible to defend. British forces in nearby Canada could seize the territory with relative ease. Losing Alaska for nothing was a very real possibility. From Russia's perspective, selling Alaska was not surrender. It was damage control. Better to sell the land to a friendly power than to watch it fall into enemy hands. The United States, still recovering from civil war but rapidly expanding westward, seemed like the safest buyer. Friendly relations with America could also act as a counterweight to British influence. Economics played a role as well. The fur trade, once Alaska's main value to Russia, was in decline. Overhunting had reduced profits, and maintaining control over the territory no longer justified the cost. Alaska was not generating wealth. It was consuming it. There was also a quiet strategic calculation. By selling Alaska to the United States, Russia would place American territory directly next to British Canada. This would complicate British strategy in North America and potentially weaken a rival without firing a shot. In imperial politics, geography itself was a weapon. So, while Americans mocked the idea of buying Alaska, Russian officials were actively searching for a way out. To them, Alaska was not a frozen treasure chest. It was an exposed flank. The goal was not profit alone, but security, influence, and prevention. When negotiations began, Russia was not desperate, but it was decisive. Alaska was never meant to be a permanent colony. It was an experiment that had run its course. And now, Russia was ready to hand it over, before history took the decision out of its hands. The deal that would change Alaska's fate hinged largely on one man's willingness to gamble his reputation. William H. Seward, the United States Secretary of State. Seward was not driven by popular opinion. In fact, he often moved directly against it. Where others saw frozen emptiness, he saw long-term strategy, and that difference in vision would nearly destroy his political career. Seward believed the future of the United States lay beyond its current borders. He thought in terms of oceans, trade routes, and global influence rather than immediate public approval. To him, Alaska was not about what the land was at the moment, but what it could become. It offered access to the Pacific, proximity to Asia, and a strategic foothold in the far north. In an age when naval power and global trade were becoming decisive, Seward saw Alaska as a piece on a much larger chessboard. But this vision came with enormous risk. Seward was already a controversial figure, known for bold ideas and political stubbornness. Pushing for the purchase meant tying himself to an unpopular cause at a time when the nation had little patience for abstract future benefits. Many in Congress saw the move as reckless. Some suspected corruption. Others believed Seward was chasing personal legacy rather than national interest. Negotiations were conducted quietly, often late at night, far from public scrutiny. The price was set quickly, but approval was anything but guaranteed. Newspapers erupted once the deal became public. Critics mocked the purchase as Seward's folly and Seward's icebox, reducing complex geopolitics to punchlines. Editorials painted Seward as out of touch, obsessed with expansion, while the country struggled at home. What made the backlash worse was the lack of immediate justification. There was no dramatic discovery to point to, no instant reward to silence critics. Alaska remained cold, distant, and silent. Seward had to defend a future no one could yet see. Still, he pressed forward. He argued that nations were built not by caution, but by foresight, that waiting for obvious value meant arriving too late. His confidence unsettled opponents, but it also carried the deal through. When the treaty was finally approved, it passed narrowly. Seward emerged victorious, but bruised. At the time, few believed he had won anything at all. History, however, was already quietly moving in his favour, even if no one yet realised it. When the Alaska Purchase was finalised in 1867, the moment itself passed with little ceremony and even less enthusiasm. There were no cheering crowds, no grand speeches, no sense that history was unfolding. The transfer of a territory larger than most nations happened quietly, almost awkwardly, as if everyone involved felt uncertain about what they were actually doing. The formal handover took place in Sitka, then known as New Archangel, a small settlement that had once served as the administrative centre of Russian America. On the appointed day, Russian and American officials gathered to lower one flag and raise another. Even this symbolic act did not go smoothly. Accounts describe confusion, delays, and a flag that became tangled as it was lowered, catching on the pole and refusing to come down easily. It was an unintentional metaphor for the uncertainty surrounding the transfer. For the people living there, the change brought more questions than answers. Russian officials prepared to leave, selling off property, dismantling infrastructure, and departing a land they had ruled lightly but consistently for decades. American administrators arrived with little understanding of the territory they had just acquired. There were few resources, vague instructions, and no clear plan for governance. Most Americans barely noticed the transfer at all. Newspapers mentioned it briefly, often with sarcasm. The nation's attention remained focused on reconstruction, political battles in Washington, and economic recovery. Alaska faded quickly into the background, a forgotten purchase tucked away at the edge of the map. But for indigenous peoples, the moment marked the beginning of profound upheaval. The treaty made no mention of them. Their land was transferred between empires without consent, consultation, or recognition. While Russian rule had been exploitative, it had at least acknowledged indigenous communities as part of the colonial system. Under American control, those protections vanished almost overnight. Legal confusion followed. Who owned the land? Who governed daily life? What laws applied? For years, Alaska existed in a strange limbo. American territory in name, but largely neglected in practice. Military administrators rotated in and out, enforcing rules inconsistently and often clashing with local populations. To critics, this only reinforced the idea that the purchase had been a mistake. Alaska seemed directionless, expensive, and disconnected. The promised future still refused to appear. Yet beneath the surface, something had changed permanently. Alaska was no longer a vulnerable outpost of a fading empire. It was now part of a growing power that, whether it realized it or not, had just extended its reach into the farthest north, and into a future that would slowly, inexorably justify the gamble. For years after the transfer, Alaska seemed determined to prove its critics right. It remained distant, underdeveloped, and largely ignored by Washington. The land was cold, transportation was primitive, and governance was minimal. To many Americans, Alaska was still nothing more than an expensive curiosity. But history was quietly preparing its rebuttal. The first cracks in the narrative appeared with gold. In the late 19th century, prospectors began uncovering gold deposits across Alaska and the Yukon region. News traveled fast. Suddenly, the frozen territory was no longer empty, it was rich. Thousands of people surged north, chasing fortune through brutal conditions. Towns sprang up almost overnight, ports filled with ships. What had once been mocked as useless now demanded attention. Gold changed Alaska's image, but it did not immediately change its treatment. The federal government remained distant, slow to invest, and often more interested in extraction than stability. Boomtowns were chaotic and dangerous. Indigenous communities were pushed aside as land was claimed, and resources seized. Alaska was valuable now, but value came with exploitation. The real transformation arrived in the 20th century with oil. Beneath Alaska's frozen surface lay vast reserves that would eventually become central to American energy strategy. When oil was discovered on the North Slope, the logic behind the purchase finally became undeniable. What had cost a few $1 million now underpinned billions in economic activity and long-term strategic security. But this vindication came at a price. Industrial development accelerated displacement. Pipelines cut across traditional lands. Environmental damage followed extraction. Alaska's wealth benefited the nation broadly, but its costs were felt locally. The land paid for its own redemption. Strategically, Alaska's value expanded beyond resources. During the Second World War and the Cold War, its location proved critical. Alaska became a frontline territory, a listening post, a defensive shield against potential northern threats. Military bases, radar stations, and infrastructure projects reshaped the landscape. What once seemed distant now felt dangerously close to global conflict. By the time critics fully realized how wrong they had been, the debate was over. Alaska was no longer questioned. It was essential. The phrase Seward's folly faded into irony, repeated only as a reminder of short-sighted judgment. Yet even as the purchase was celebrated as a masterstroke, the story remained incomplete. Wealth and strategy explained the nation's gain, but not the human cost. Alaska had proven its value to the United States. The question that lingered was whether the United States had proven worthy of Alaska. While gold, oil, and strategy slowly justified the Alaska purchase in the American imagination, those narratives left out the people who had always been there. For indigenous communities, the purchase was not a clever deal or a future investment. It was the moment their land became a commodity exchanged between distant powers without consent. When Russia transferred Alaska to the United States, indigenous peoples were not consulted, named, or protected in any meaningful way. The treaty treated the land as empty space, ignoring societies that had lived, traded, hunted, and governed themselves there for thousands of years. What changed was not ownership in any moral sense, but authority, the power to decide what would happen next. Under early American administration, indigenous communities faced confusion and erosion of rights. Russian rule had been exploitative, but it had recognized native groups as part of the colonial structure. The United States initially offered no such framework. Legal status was unclear. Land ownership was undefined. Traditional systems of governance were disregarded. Alaska existed under military rule for years, and indigenous peoples were subject to laws they had no role in shaping. As settlers and prospectors arrived, pressure intensified. Gold rushes brought displacement, disease, and violence. Land that had sustained communities for generations was suddenly claimed, fenced, or polluted. Hunting grounds were restricted. Rivers were diverted. The arrival of American industry reshaped the environment faster than communities could adapt. Cultural damage followed material loss. Children were sent to boarding schools designed to erase language, customs, and identity. Hair was cut. Names were changed. Traditions were labelled backward. The same tools of assimilation used elsewhere in the United States were deployed in Alaska, often with little oversight due to the territory's remoteness. Oil development and military expansion in the 20th century added new layers of disruption. Pipelines crossed ancestral lands. Bases restricted access to traditional areas. While some indigenous groups eventually gained compensation or legal recognition, those victories came late and only after prolonged struggle. This history complicates the story of success. Alaska was indeed a geopolitical and economic gain for the United States, but it was also a loss of autonomy, continuity, and security for the people who had never sold it. Understanding the Alaska purchase fully means holding both truths at once. It was a strategic triumph built on displacement, a visionary gamble that succeeded materially, while leaving unresolved moral questions that still echo across Alaska's vast, beautiful, and contested landscape. For decades after its purchase, Alaska existed in a strange political in-between. It belonged to the United States, but it was not treated as fully American. It was governed from afar, spoken about rarely, and invested in reluctantly. This long period of neglect shaped Alaska as much as any gold rush or pipeline ever would. After the initial transfer, Alaska was placed under military control, not civilian government. Laws were enforced inconsistently, and local populations, both indigenous and non-indigenous, had little say in how the territory was run. Washington viewed Alaska as too distant to prioritize and too unimportant to empower. It was administered, not represented. Settlers quickly realized that Alaska lacked the basic political rights enjoyed elsewhere in the country. There was no voting representation in Congress. Federal decisions were made with minimal local input. Resources flowed out, but authority rarely flowed in. Alaska produced value, but remained politically voiceless. This neglect created tension. As population slowly grew, so did demands for recognition. Residents wanted infrastructure, schools, courts, and a say in governance. They wanted Alaska to stop being treated as a remote extraction zone and start being treated as a place where people actually lived. At the same time, the the federal government remained cautious. Granting Alaska greater autonomy raised uncomfortable questions about land ownership, indigenous rights, and long-term responsibility. It was easier to delay than to confront these issues directly. World events eventually forced change. During the Second World War, Alaska's strategic importance became impossible to ignore. Japanese attacks in the Aleutian Islands shattered the illusion that Alaska was safely distant from global conflict. Suddenly, the territory was not peripheral. It was exposed. Military investment surged. Infrastructure expanded rapidly. Roads, airfields, and bases were built at unprecedented speed. This attention altered how Alaska was perceived. It was no longer a forgotten purchase. It was a frontline territory. The Cold War only deepened this shift, as Alaska became a critical northern shield and surveillance point. Defense spending brought jobs, population growth, and permanent American presence. Yet even as Alaska's importance grew, political equality lagged behind. It took decades of lobbying, debate, and frustration before statehood became a serious possibility. Alaska had proven its value many times over. What it had not yet secured was recognition as an equal partner in the Union. The struggle for statehood was not just about flags and paperwork. It was about ending limbo, about finally acknowledging that Alaska was not an experiment, not a gamble, and not a mistake, but a permanent and consequential part of the American story. When Alaska finally became a state in 1959, the moment was framed as a triumph. The long period of political limbo was over. Alaska now had representation, a constitution, and a formal voice in the federal system. On paper, the gamble of 1867 had reached its logical conclusion. But statehood did not resolve the deeper question of who truly benefited from the purchase. For many Alaskans, statehood brought opportunity. Federal investment increased, infrastructure expanded, roads, schools, and public services improved. Political participation became real, rather than symbolic. Alaska was no longer governed entirely from afar. Decisions could finally be shaped locally, at least in theory. But power over land remained uneven. Vast portions of Alaska were controlled by the federal government, not the state itself. National parks, military zones, and federally managed lands dominated the map. While this preserved wilderness, it also limited local authority. Alaska was a state, but not a typical one. Control was shared, fragmented, and often contested. Resource wealth intensified these tensions. Oil revenue transformed Alaska's economy and funded ambitious public programs. The state's decision to distribute oil profits directly to residents through annual payments became famous. It was a rare example of resource wealth being shared broadly rather than disappearing upward. Yet even this system masked deeper inequalities. Those closest to extraction sites bore environmental and cultural costs that financial compensation could not fully address. For indigenous communities, statehood was not liberation. It was another transition imposed from above. While later legislation would restore some land rights and recognize native corporations, these measures came after decades of dispossession. Statehood did not undo the damage of earlier neglect. It merely changed the structure through which disputes were managed. Nationally, Alaska became a symbol of foresight. The purchase was now celebrated as one of the greatest land deals in history. The narrative focused on numbers. How little was paid, how much was gained. This framing turned the story into a lesson about smart strategy and long-term thinking. But that celebration often ignored the human dimension. It reduced Alaska to acreage and assets, rather than lived experience. The success of the deal was measured in profit and power, not justice or consent. Statehood marked Alaska's full entry into the American system, but it did not settle the moral ledger. It simply moved the debate into a new phase, one where the land's value was undeniable, but the costs of acquiring and using it were finally impossible to ignore. Looking back from the present, the Alaska purchase is often framed as an obvious triumph. The price seems laughably small. The resources are immense. The strategic value is unquestioned. From this distance, the critics of 1867 appear short-sighted, even foolish. Seward's folly has become a punchline, a reminder that bold vision beats timid thinking. But this neat conclusion hides a far more complicated truth. Seward was right, but not in the way the legend suggests. He did not foresee gold rushes, oil pipelines, or Cold War radar stations. He did not predict exact outcomes. What he understood was uncertainty. He grasped that power in the modern world would belong to nations willing to think beyond immediate comfort and visible profit. Alaska represented possibility, not guarantees. That was the gamble. At the same time, the success of the purchase cannot be separated from its consequences. The United States gained land, leverage, and wealth, but it did so by absorbing a place already inhabited, already meaningful, and already contested. The deal treated territory as empty because it was politically convenient to do so. That logic did not vanish with time. It shaped how Alaska was governed, developed, and justified for generations. The story of the Alaska Purchase reveals something deeper about empire and expansion. Strategic brilliance often depends on distance, distance from those affected, distance from consequences, distance from moral reckoning. From Washington, Alaska was a map problem. From the ground, it was a homeland being redefined without consent. And yet, history rarely offers clean verdicts. Alaska today is neither simply a victim nor merely a prize. It is a place of resilience, complexity, and contradiction. Its people have adapted, resisted, negotiated, and endured. The land has been exploited, protected, fought over, and cherished, sometimes all at once. So was the Alaska Purchase a mistake? Economically and strategically, no. It reshaped American power in ways that still matter. But morally, it remains unfinished business. The deal solved Russia's vulnerability and expanded American reach, while creating new inequalities that echo into the present. In the end, Seward's folly was neither folly nor pure genius. It was a turning point, one that reminds us that history's greatest successes are often built on questions we are still trying to answer. Aristotle was born in the small town of Stagira, on the northern edge of the Greek world, a place closer to courts and craftsmen than to poets and philosophers. This distance mattered. Aristotle did not grow up immersed in abstract debate or mythic storytelling. He grew up around medicine, tools, and observation. His father, Nicomachus, served as court physician to the Macedonian royal family, a role that shaped Aristotle long before he ever encountered philosophy. Medicine in the ancient world was not theoretical. It required attention to detail, patience, and an acceptance that nature followed patterns that could be studied. From an early age, Aristotle would have seen bodies examined, symptoms compared, and conclusions drawn from evidence rather than tradition. This practical exposure planted a seed that never left him. Knowledge comes from looking closely at the world, not merely imagining it. Tragedy arrived early. Aristotle lost both parents while still young. Orphaned and displaced, he was sent away from Stagira to be raised by guardians. This early separation stripped him of a stable homeland and family identity. Unlike thinkers rooted in a single city or tradition, Aristotle grew up slightly unanchored. The world was not something he inherited. It was something he had to understand. This outsider perspective would define his intellectual life. Aristotle learned to watch rather than assume, to analyze rather than participate blindly. Where others accepted inherited wisdom, he questioned its foundations. He was not raised into certainty. He grew into inquiry. As a teenager, Aristotle was sent south to Athens, the intellectual capital of the Greek world. There, ideas collided openly, and reputation mattered as much as insight. Athens was loud with argument, filled with schools competing for influence and students. It was here that Aristotle entered Plato's academy, stepping into a tradition built on abstract forms, ideals, and metaphysical speculation. But Aristotle did not arrive as a blank slate. He brought with him a mind shaped by biology, medicine, and lived observation. From the beginning, there was tension between what he had learned from nature and what he was now taught about eternal truths. That tension would never resolve. It would fuel his entire career. Before Aristotle became the architect of logic, or the classifier of life, he was a young man shaped by loss, movement, and exposure to the physical world. His philosophy would always carry the imprint of that beginning. Grounded, restless, and deeply suspicious of knowledge that floated too far above reality. When he arrived in Athens, the intellectual gravity of the city was impossible to escape. Philosophers debated in public, schools competed for influence, and ideas were treated as both sport and weapon. At the centre of this world stood Plato, whose academy was not merely a school, but a way of thinking about reality itself. To enter it was to step into a universe built on ideals, forms, and the belief that truth existed beyond the physical world. Aristotle remained at the academy for nearly 2 decades. This was not a brief apprenticeship, but a long intellectual immersion. He studied, taught, debated, and absorbed Plato's system deeply. Few students stayed as long, and fewer still challenged their teacher as rigorously. Aristotle respected Plato profoundly, but he never surrendered his independence. Plato's philosophy placed ultimate reality in perfect, unchanging forms, abstract ideals that physical objects only imperfectly copied. For Plato, the senses were unreliable. True knowledge came from reason alone. This view clashed quietly but persistently with Aristotle's instincts. Where Plato looked upward, Aristotle kept looking outward. He could not ignore what he saw, touched, and measured, and, over time, this difference hardened into philosophical tension. Aristotle began to argue that forms did not exist in some separate realm, but within things themselves. A horse was not a flawed copy of an ideal horse. It was a horse, fully real and worthy of study. This shift may sound subtle, but it was revolutionary. It dragged philosophy back down to earth. Despite disagreement, Aristotle thrived at the academy. He earned a reputation as a formidable lecturer and relentless thinker. Some accounts suggest he was called the Reader because of his intense study habits. He dissected arguments with precision, questioned assumptions others took for granted, and pushed discussions toward clarity. Yet he never became Plato's chosen successor. That honour went to others more aligned with Platonic metaphysics. When Plato died, Aristotle left Athens. The decision was partly political, partly philosophical. Athens had grown hostile to Macedonians, and Aristotle's background made him vulnerable. But there was also a deeper reason. He had outgrown the academy. Those 20 years mattered enormously. Plato gave Aristotle a foundation, a discipline, and an opponent. The ideas Aristotle would later build were forged in dialogue with Plato's thought, sometimes refining it, often resisting it. He would later say that while he loved Plato, he loved truth more. That sentence defines their relationship and the birth of a new way of thinking. After leaving Athens, Aristotle's life took a dramatic turn, away from lecture halls and into the world of power. He was invited north to Macedonia by King Philip, who wanted the best possible education for his son. That son was Alexander the Great, a boy who would soon reshape the known world. Aristotle was no longer just a philosopher. He was now shaping a ruler. The setting itself was unusual. Aristotle taught Alexander not in a crowded city, but in a carefully arranged environment designed for focused learning. This isolation allowed philosophy, science, ethics, and politics to be taught as tools of leadership rather than abstract puzzles. Aristotle approached the task seriously. He believed rulers needed more than strength. They needed judgment. The curriculum went far beyond rhetoric. Aristotle introduced Alexander to Homer, especially the Iliad, which Alexander reportedly carried with him on campaign. But Aristotle did not teach Homer as poetry alone. He used it to discuss honour, rage, leadership, restraint, and consequence. Myth became moral training. Aristotle also emphasized observation of the natural world. He encouraged Alexander to study geography, animals, and peoples. This perspective mattered later, as Alexander's campaigns brought him into contact with cultures far beyond Greece. Aristotle's influence can be seen in Alexander's curiosity, his habit of asking questions, and his desire to understand what he conquered rather than simply destroy it. Yet the relationship was not without tension. Aristotle believed firmly in Greek superiority and held views about non-Greeks that modern readers find deeply troubling. He taught Alexander that Greeks were naturally suited to rule, while others were meant to be governed. Alexander would later both follow and violate this teaching, sometimes adopting local customs and elevating non-Greeks in ways that unsettled his former tutor. Still, the intellectual imprint remained. Aristotle gave Alexander a framework for thinking about power, ethics, and purpose. Conquest was not just about territory, it was about order, culture, and legacy. Whether Alexander truly absorbed Aristotle's restraint is debatable, but he absorbed his ambition for greatness. Eventually, the student outgrew the classroom. Alexander left to conquer. Aristotle returned to philosophy. Their paths diverged, but the connection endured symbolically. One expanded the physical boundaries of the world. The other expanded its intellectual ones. This chapter of Aristotle's life reveals something essential about him. He was not a detached thinker hiding from reality. He engaged directly with power, shaping it where he could. And in doing so, he tested whether philosophy could survive contact with the most dangerous force of all, ambition. When Aristotle returned to Athens, he did not go back to the academy. That decision was deliberate. His years under Plato had taught him discipline, but they had also clarified his differences. Aristotle was no longer interested in a philosophy that floated above the world. He wanted one that walked through it, catalogued it, and tested it against reality. So he founded his own school, the Lyceum. The Lyceum was unlike anything Athens had seen before. Teaching did not happen only in fixed lecture halls. Aristotle and his students walked as they discussed ideas, earning the school the nickname the Peripatetic School, from the Greek word for walking. Thought, in Aristotle's view, was not static. It moved, examined, paused, and moved again, much like life itself. Here, Aristotle began the work that would define him forever. He did not restrict himself to one discipline. Instead, he treated knowledge as a connected system. Logic mattered because it structured thought. Biology mattered because life demanded explanation. Ethics mattered because humans had to act. Politics mattered because no one lived alone. Philosophy, to Aristotle, was not a single subject. It was the study of how everything fit together. This approach was radical. Earlier thinkers often focused on what was eternal and unchanging. Aristotle focused on what existed and how it behaved. He dissected animals, observed plants, compared constitutions, and analysed poetry. Nothing was too small or too ordinary to deserve attention. If something existed, it could teach you something. At the Lyceum, knowledge was collected systematically. Students gathered data, recorded observations, and classified information. This was not speculation for its own sake. Aristotle wanted causes, patterns, and explanations grounded in evidence. He believed understanding came from asking not just what something was, but why it was that way. This shift laid the foundation for scientific thinking. Aristotle did not conduct experiments in the modern sense, but he insisted on careful observation and logical structure. Errors crept into his work, as they inevitably do when knowledge is expanding for the first time. But the method mattered more than the mistakes. He showed that the world could be studied systematically rather than mythically. The Lyceum became a hub of intellectual production. Aristotle wrote constantly, often in dense, technical prose meant for students rather than the public. These works were not polished dialogues like Plato's. They were working documents, tools for thinking. In founding the Lyceum, Aristotle created more than a school. He created a new posture toward reality. Philosophy from this point on would no longer be satisfied with contemplation alone. It would demand explanation. At the Lyceum, Aristotle turned his attention to something more fundamental than biology or politics, the structure of thinking itself. If humans were going to understand the world, he believed, they first needed to understand how reasoning worked. This led him to create what would later be called formal logic, not as an abstract game, but as a practical tool for truth. Before Aristotle, people argued brilliantly but inconsistently. Reasoning followed intuition, rhetoric, or tradition. Aristotle wanted rules. He analysed how conclusions followed from premises and why some arguments felt convincing even when they were false. From this effort emerged the syllogism, a structured form of reasoning where, if the premises were true, the conclusion had to be true as well. This was revolutionary. Thought itself now had a skeleton. But Aristotle did not stop at logic. He wanted to know why things existed and why they behaved as they did. To answer this, he developed his theory of causes. Every object or event, he argued, could be understood through four causes: what it was made of, what shape or form it took, what brought it into being, and what purpose it served. These were not competing explanations. Together, they formed a complete account. This idea reshaped inquiry. Instead of asking a single question, Aristotle encouraged asking many, each revealing a different layer of reality. A statue was not explained fully by the stone it was carved from, nor by the sculptor alone, nor by its shape, nor by its purpose. Truth emerged from seeing all causes together. Purpose, in particular, mattered deeply to Aristotle. He believed nature did nothing without reason. Plants grew toward light. Animals developed organs suited to their survival. Humans possessed reason because they were meant to use it. This belief in purpose, known as teleology, would dominate Western thought for centuries. Critically, Aristotle applied these ideas everywhere. He used them to explain living organisms, political systems, works of art, and human behavior. Logic gave him structure. Causes gave him depth. Together, they allowed him to build explanations that felt complete rather than partial. Modern science would eventually reject some of Aristotle's conclusions, especially his assumptions about purpose in nature, but it inherited his ambition to explain the world systematically. Even when later thinkers disagreed with him, they argued on terrain he had defined. In this chapter of his life, Aristotle did something extraordinary. He did not just offer answers. He designed the tools by which answers could be sought. Thought itself became something that could be studied, disciplined, and improved, and Western philosophy would never escape that framework again. As Aristotle's work expanded, he turned from explaining the world to confronting a more intimate problem: how humans ought to live within it. For him, ethics was not about abstract rules or divine commands. It was about practice. A good life was not declared, it was built, habit by habit, choice by choice. Aristotle rejected the idea that virtue came from birth or inspiration alone. Instead, he argued that character was formed through repetition. People became just by doing just acts, brave by performing brave acts, and temperate by practicing restraint. Morality, in his view, was closer to a skill than a belief. You learned it the same way you learned music or athletics, through training. Central to this vision was his idea of the mean. Virtue existed between extremes. Courage lay between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity lay between miserliness and waste. The correct action depended on context, judgment, and experience. There was no universal formula that could replace wisdom. This made Aristotle's ethics demanding. You could not outsource moral thinking. You had to cultivate it. Happiness, or flourishing, was the ultimate goal. But Aristotle did not define happiness as pleasure or comfort. He described it as a life of activity in accordance with reason. Humans were rational animals, and to live well meant using that rationality fully. A life without thought, no matter how comfortable, fell short of its potential. Importantly, Aristotle believed ethics could not be separated from community. No one became virtuous alone. Families, friendships, and political structures shaped character. Laws mattered because they trained citizens over time. Bad laws produced bad habits. Good laws made virtue easier. Ethics, therefore, was inseparable from politics. This view made Aristotle both practical and controversial. He accepted hierarchy as natural, and believed not everyone was equally capable of virtue in the same way. Some of his conclusions, especially regarding women and enslaved people, reflected the limits of his society rather than universal insight. Yet even here, his method remained consistent. He observed existing structures and tried to explain how they functioned, not how they ideally should. What makes Aristotle's ethics endure is its realism. He did not promise moral perfection. He promised improvement. He acknowledged weakness, habit, and failure, but insisted that character could be shaped through effort and reflection. In framing ethics as a lifelong practice, rather than a rule book, Aristotle offered something rare in ancient thought. A philosophy meant to be lived daily, not in moments of heroism, but in ordinary choices, where, he believed, a human life was truly made. For Aristotle, politics was not a dirty necessity or a secondary concern. It was the natural extension of ethics. If ethics asked how an individual should live, politics asked how people should live together. A good life, he believed, was impossible outside a well-ordered community. Humans were not meant to live alone. They were, by nature, political animals. Aristotle approached politics the same way he approached biology, through comparison and observation. He studied dozens of city-states, examining their laws, customs, and power structures. Rather than designing a perfect society from imagination, he analysed real ones. What worked, what failed, what endured. Political theory for him began with evidence. He categorised governments into different types, distinguishing between rule by one, by a few, or by many. But more important than who ruled was why they ruled. Governments that served the common good were legitimate. Those that served only private interest were corrupt. Kingship could become tyranny. Aristocracy could decay into oligarchy. Democracy could collapse into mob rule. No system was immune to failure. Unlike Plato, Aristotle did not believe in philosopher kings. He distrusted perfection. Instead, he favoured mixed systems that balanced power and restrained extremes. Stability mattered more than idealism. A government that lasted and allowed citizens to live decently was better than one that promised greatness and delivered chaos. Law played a central role in this vision. Good laws trained citizens over time, shaping habits and expectations. Politics was not about dramatic reform, but slow cultivation. Change imposed too quickly risked destroying the very character it aimed to improve. Yet Aristotle's political thought also reveals his limits. He accepted slavery as natural and believed some people were destined to be ruled. He excluded women from full political participation. These views were not accidents. They reflected the social boundaries of his world. Aristotle analysed reality as he found it, and sometimes failed to imagine how it could be otherwise. Still, his method mattered. By grounding politics in human behaviour, rather than divine command, he made it a subject of reason. Power could be studied, constitutions could be compared, failure could be explained. Aristotle's politics was not about utopia. It was about managing imperfection. He understood that humans were flawed, driven by desire, fear, and ambition. The task of politics was not to erase those traits, but to channel them into something stable. In doing so, Aristotle laid the groundwork for political realism. Governments would rise and fall, but understanding why they did so was the first step toward governing wisely, even when perfection remained out of reach. As Aristotle's influence grew, so did resentment. Athens was a city that celebrated philosophy, but it was also a city that had executed Socrates when thought became inconvenient. Aristotle understood this history intimately, and near the end of his life, it would shape one of his most decisive choices. After the death of Alexander the Great, Athens turned sharply against anything associated with Macedonian power. Aristotle, despite having lived and taught in Athens for years, was suddenly vulnerable. His past as Alexander's tutor and his connections to Macedonia became liabilities. Philosophy did not protect him from politics. It never had. Charges were brought against him for impiety, the same accusation once used against Socrates. The specifics mattered less than the atmosphere. Aristotle recognized the pattern. Athens was looking for a symbol to punish, not a truth to uncover. He famously remarked that he would not allow the city to sin twice against philosophy. Rather than stand trial, he chose exile. This decision reveals a side of Aristotle often overlooked. He was not reckless. He did not romanticize martyrdom. He believed reason mattered more than symbolic sacrifice. Preserving one's work, one's students, and one's ability to think freely outweighed the honor of public defiance. Wisdom, in his view, included knowing when to withdraw. Aristotle left Athens and settled in Chalcis, where he lived quietly. His final years were not filled with lectures or public debate, but reflection. The man who had categorized governments now experienced their instability firsthand. The thinker who believed in law witnessed how easily law could be weaponized. This exile underscored a harsh truth Aristotle never denied. Reason was fragile in the face of fear and power. Philosophical systems could be elegant and rigorous, but they existed within societies that were emotional, reactive, and political. No amount of logic guaranteed safety. Yet, Aristotle did not abandon philosophy. Even in retreat, his work continued to circulate among students. The Lyceum endured. Ideas moved even when bodies were forced to flee. In this chapter of his life, Aristotle embodied his own ethics. He chose the path that preserved thought rather than pride. He accepted imperfection rather than risk annihilation. Exile for him was not defeat. It was the final acknowledgement that philosophy must survive the world it seeks to understand, even when that world turns hostile. When Aristotle died in exile in 322 BCE, there was no sense that the world had just lost one of its central minds. He left behind no political movement, no empire, no dramatic final stand. What he left instead were texts, dense, technical, unfinished in places, and almost entirely misunderstood in their own time. For centuries, his influence would be indirect, fragile, and nearly lost. After his death, Aristotle's works did not circulate widely in polished form. They survived largely as lecture notes, teaching manuals, and internal documents preserved by his students. Some were copied, others were forgotten. Many disappeared altogether. For a time, Plato's more elegant dialogues overshadowed Aristotle's methodical prose. Philosophy favoured beauty over precision. The real resurrection of Aristotle came much later, carried across cultures rather than generations. Islamic scholars preserved, translated, and expanded his work at a time when much of Europe had forgotten it. His logic, metaphysics, and natural philosophy were studied intensely, commented on, and refined. When these works re-entered Europe in the medieval period, they did not arrive as curiosities. They arrived as a system. Aristotle became the backbone of education. His logic structured how people argued. His categories shaped how reality was divided. His ethics framed debates about virtue. His politics influenced theories of government. For nearly 2,000 years, to think seriously in the West was to think through Aristotle, whether one agreed with him or not. Even the scientific revolution, which overturned many of his conclusions, did not escape his influence. Early scientists defined themselves by rejecting Aristotle precisely because he had defined the terrain so completely. His mistakes mattered because his questions were foundational. What makes Aristotle's legacy extraordinary is not that he was always right. He was often wrong. It is that he believed everything could be studied, organized, and understood through reason. He refused to limit philosophy to the heavens or the soul. He brought it into plants, animals, laws, friendships, and daily life. Aristotle did not give the world a single doctrine. He gave it a habit of mind. Observe carefully, define clearly, ask why, look for causes, accept complexity. That habit outlived empires, religions, and revolutions. And in that sense, Aristotle did not merely influence Western thought, he helped teach it how to think at all.